The day began like any other in a house on the outskirts of Mapleton, Georgia. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in the kitchen window, painting the morning with warm golden colors. The whole atmosphere of this house radiated coziness and tranquility. It was here, among the old-fashioned furniture and serene landscape, that Iris Phillips felt herself the happiest woman on earth. Iris was the woman who was looked at with slight envy in the neighborhood, the perfect wife, kind and gentle, able to create comfort, care, and harmony in the house. Her soft features, eyes shining with calmness and kindness, and a warm smile mesmerized everyone who entered their home. But behind this outward perfection, there was also a certain naivety, an almost childlike belief that the world was fair and safe. Her husband, Daniel, on the other hand, was the epitome of masculine confidence and charm. Tall, trim, with brown eyes that sparkled, he seemed to be a reliable support not only for Iris, but for everyone around him. Working as a manager in a construction company, he was a respected and charming man, easy to get along with. People respected him for his determination and ability to make difficult decisions. But behind his mask of a confident and calm husband, there was another side. Mornings at the Phillips house usually began with a traditional ritual. Iris brewed coffee, prepared breakfast, and Daniel went out on the terrace to breathe in the fresh air and admire the garden that he and Iris had spent a long, painstaking time organizing together. Today was no different, at least for Iris. "Are you late for work today?" Iris looked at her husband softly, setting the mug of steaming coffee in front of him. "No, I have to be in the office by 9 as usual," Daniel answered, smiling over his shoulder. Iris didn't suspect a thing. She looked at Daniel lovingly, not even thinking about the fact that his thoughts were already far from that cozy place. His mind was completely occupied with another woman, Kiara, Iris's cousin. Ciara had not appeared in Iris's life by accident. The sisters, though related by blood, had always been different. Kiara, a couple years younger than Iris, was characterized by her bold and passionate nature. While Iris grew up in peace and quiet, content with the family warmth and love, Kiara felt unwanted and deprived from childhood. She envied her sister, her success at school, her friends, and of course the family affection that Iris always got more of. Since childhood, Kiara had lived in her sister's shadow. Her parents always praised Iris for her obedience, modesty, and diligence. Kiara, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Her rebellious spirit and her desire for freedom only made the gap between them wider. Ciara loved to take risks, and her life paths were always full of drama and instability. She lived her life the way she wanted to live it, and despite all the setbacks, she looked for ways to prove to herself and those around her that she was worth more. When Iris married Daniel, Ciara seemed resigned to the fact that her sister had overtaken her once again. Iris had become the epitome of what Ciara had always wanted: the perfect marriage, a home, stability. But the years hadn't dulled her jealousy, and when Ciara returned to Mapleton after a failed marriage and several years of wandering, that jealousy flared up with renewed vigor. Daniel met Ciara at a family reunion a few months after her return to town. She was bright and vibrant, the complete opposite of Iris. Where Iris was calm and gentle, Ciara radiated fire and passion. Her eyes sparkled with boldness. Her words were always full of challenge, and her confidence attracted men. Daniel had sensed that attraction at first sight. He was amazed at her boldness, her ability to stir emotions in him that he hadn't felt in a marriage in a long time. Ciara played on his weaknesses, easily manipulated, drawing him closer and closer to her. Their romance began with fleeting glances and half hints that quickly escalated into secret meetings. For Daniel, it was just an escape from routine, a chance to feel alive, risky and unpredictable. For Ciara, however, it was more than that. She saw it as a chance to finally take what had always belonged to Iris. For Ciara, the affair wasn't just a love adventure, but a way to prove to herself that she was worthy of more. The more they dated, the stronger her desires became. She no longer wanted to be her sister's shadow. She wanted to be in her shoes. One of their first secret dates was an evening at a small hotel on the outskirts of town. Ciara had dressed for the occasion as if it were her last fight, a tight red dress that emphasized her figure and flashy makeup. She knew Daniel would lose his head as soon as he saw her. "You look incredible," Daniel exhaled as she opened the room door for him. Ciara only grinned, pulling him inside. The evening passed like so many after that. Passion, wine, quiet whispers of promises and lies that led them both deeper and deeper into the abyss. For Ciara, this was the beginning of a plan. She didn't want to be just a lover. She wanted to be something more. "Why are you still with her?" At one point, looking up at the ceiling after another encounter, Ciara asked. Her voice was full of hidden menace. Daniel exhaled nervously. He wasn't ready for this conversation. It was just a crush for him, a way to escape the monotony of life with Iris. "I love her, Ciara," he replied quietly, trying to avoid a direct answer. "Do you?" Ciara grinned bitterly. "If you did, you wouldn't be here with me." Ciara's words began to seep into his mind like poison. She knew how to press his weaknesses, to make him think about what he might get if he decided to take more drastic steps. She didn't rush him, but her tone was eloquent. The time when she could be content with being a second woman was coming to an end. For Iris, however, the world remained cloudless. She suspected nothing. Every day she continued to care for her husband, to enjoy his presence, to plan their future together. Iris sincerely believed that their life was perfect, that they were an example for others. But deep inside, she began to feel that something had changed. Little things. Daniel started coming home late from work, sometimes avoiding her gaze, increasingly silent and distant. Iris wrote it off as stress at work, because they'd been talking about his project at the company for a long time. However, her intuition wouldn't leave her alone. She noticed his phone constantly on silent mode, and there were traces of him in his pockets that bothered her. But every time she was about to ask a question, something inside stopped. She didn't want to ruin this perfect world they were building together. Meanwhile, Ciara was getting more and more immersed in her game. She couldn't stop anymore. It had been a few weeks since Ciara and Daniel had started their secret dating game. For Daniel, it was still just a hobby, a spice to a monotonous life. But for Ciara, the relationship was becoming an obsession she could no longer tolerate being the second woman. Her demands on Daniel became more and more insistent, and cracks began to appear between them. The day Daniel arrived at Ciara's house after another day of work, she met him with an expression full of intense determination. At first glance, Ciara appeared calm, but beneath the surface her emotions raged like a volcano ready to erupt. She could no longer live in Iris's shadow, and every moment spent away from Daniel reminded her of that. Daniel noticed the change in her mood as soon as he stepped into her apartment. Their relationship had become much more strained in recent days. Ciara was no longer satisfied with the occasional encounter. She wanted more, something that would ruin everything. In the silence of the room, amidst the semi-dark shadows, Ciara approached Daniel. No longer playing the role of mistress, she went on the offensive. Her gaze was hard and cold. She expected an answer to a question that had been looming in the air for a long time. Meanwhile, Iris continued her daily routine as before, trying to ignore the minor oddities in her husband's behavior. Her inner voice, which had previously only whispered quietly of suspicion, was now much louder. Daniel was staying late at work more and more often, avoiding her gaze at breakfast, and she couldn't help but notice how he seemed to dissolve into his thoughts, becoming distant and aloof. One evening at dinner, Iris watched her husband quietly. His hands were moving as he ate, but his eyes were empty, staring off into the distance, as if he were not here with her in their cozy dining room. Iris tried to make conversation, to ask him about work, about business, about weekend plans, but his answers were brief and evasive. "Is everything all right?" she asked once, finally unable to bear his silent detachment. Daniel gave her a brief glance as if snapping out of his thoughts. "Yes, of course. It's just a lot of work," he replied, then withdrew into himself again. Iris wanted to believe him, but her intuition told her it wasn't about work. A sense of unease began to mature inside her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on where it was coming from. There was something about Daniel's behavior that worried her more every day. At this time, Ciara couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. She longed to shatter the illusion that Iris and Daniel lived in. She didn't want to be the other one. She wanted to take Iris's place. She wanted Daniel to belong to her completely. Every time he left for his wife, she was overcome with waves of hatred and jealousy. Ciara didn't just demand attention. She demanded a solution. Every conversation they had increasingly boiled down to the same thing. She was tired of being second best, and she wasn't going to wait any longer. Daniel, for his part, felt the pressure building. Ciara was pushing him harder and harder, her demands getting louder. He realized he couldn't continue this double life indefinitely. But leaving Iris seemed impossible to him. She was part of his life, part of his past, and his future. Daniel couldn't imagine a world without her. But he couldn't give up on Ciara either. Each meeting with Ciara became more and more tense. She was no longer accepting his excuses and evasive answers. Her patience was wearing thin, and her passion began to grow into something darker and more dangerous. All the while, Iris continued to notice small details that disturbed her. Daniel's phone was always face down, as if he didn't want her to accidentally see incoming messages. Sometimes his clothes smelled strange, as if he'd spent time somewhere she didn't belong. But when she asked him about work, he always found answers that put her at ease, at least for a while. Iris started talking to her friends about it. At first, it was only innocent remarks. "He's been working so much lately. He seems so tired." But soon her friends began to notice the changes as well. One of her closest friends, Savannah, invited Iris out for a walk one evening, and as they talked, she cautiously asked, "Are you sure everything's okay between you two?" Iris hesitated, not knowing how to answer. Deep down, she felt that something had changed, but she couldn't admit it even to herself. Could she have suspected Daniel of cheating on her? Could she have believed that their perfect family could have been jeopardized? She'd rejected even the thought of it, clinging to the illusion of stability for as long as she could. But the cracks in their relationship were growing deeper. From the outside, the Phillips house still looked as immaculate as ever. Neighbors still smiled when they saw Iris on the street, greeted her with friendly faces, not noticing anything out of the ordinary. They saw only what they wanted to see, a happy family where nothing seemed to go wrong. But in small towns like Mapleton, rumors always find a way. People watched every move, every change in behavior, and soon, gossip began to spread around the neighborhood. Neighbors in their kitchens, gathering for tea, shared suspicions that Daniel had been seen with another woman, and that woman was not his wife. Iris didn't know it yet, but a disturbing suspicion was already beginning to ripen in her heart. Her inner tension was growing, and those who were close to her couldn't help but notice it. Ciara, for her part, wasn't about to accept the status quo. She saw Daniel's distance from her, his hesitation in trying to save his marriage. She saw that he didn't want to leave Iris, and it fueled her rage. Ciara wanted more. Her patience was coming to an end. Her thoughts were growing darker and more determined. Something began to ripen in her mind that she couldn't stop, a plan that would end this uncertainty once and for all. One evening, as Iris and Daniel sat on the veranda of their house, she finally decided to ask him the question that had been on her mind for a long time. "Daniel, are you sure we're okay?" Her voice was quiet, but full of underlying concern. Daniel looked at her, and something flashed in his eyes that she couldn't understand. He smiled as he usually did, but his smile lacked the sincerity that always accompanied it. "Of course, Iris, it's all right." But Iris couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. There was a premonition inside her that things were about to change irreversibly. The quiet night in Mapleton seemed to promise another peaceful chapter in Daniel and Iris's life. Their house was enveloped in the familiar silence, punctuated only occasionally by the rustle of the wind outside the windows or the distant howl of a police siren from the outskirts of town, but no one that evening expected that this serene peace would turn to terror. Night fell as usual, and Iris, tired after a long day, went to bed earlier than usual. Daniel stayed on the ground floor. He often spent his evenings on the computer, ostensibly dealing with work-related issues. But Iris noticed that lately he'd been shutting himself off more and more. She decided not to disturb him tonight and lay alone, leaving the bedroom door ajar so she could hear his footsteps when he came upstairs. The clock struck midnight. The town had fallen into a deep sleep, and the silence was almost ominous. But tragedy was already brewing in the Phillips house. No one knew that on this night, Ordinary life would crumble like a house of cards, and the traces of this destruction would be imprinted on every corner of their cozy home. When Daniel finally went upstairs, he expected to find Iris sleeping peacefully, but the picture he saw was so eerie that his breath hitched. The bedroom was dark, and the first thing that struck him was the odor. He knew immediately that something was wrong. His heart began to pound frantically as he walked over to the bed. Iris was lying there, but she was awake. Blood profusely flooded the sheets, clothes, and Iris's body. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in a perpetual grimace of horror. The bloody sheet emphasized that this death was far from peaceful. Her face and body showed signs of struggle, but she had not escaped in time. There were upturned objects lying around, a nightlamp, a few books from a shelf that she must have knocked over when she tried to resist. Every corner of the room seemed to bear witness to the violent struggle. Daniel stood stunned by the horror of what was happening, unable to believe it was real. Iris's body was still warm. He ran over to her, trying to wake her, but her frozen stare and hoarse silence confirmed that she was dead. He screamed, not knowing what to do. Shock tore at his mind, and it was only after a few seconds that stretched like an eternity that he realized to call the police. His hands were shaking as he dialed 911. When the police arrived on the scene, the picture of the murder was horrifying. Iris, who had recently been a cheerful, trusting woman, was now the victim of a brutal massacre. The bedroom looked like a scene from a nightmare. Blood on the walls, broken furniture indicating a furious struggle, and a body that told the story of the horror experienced in the last moments of life. Daniel was in a state of shock. He sat on the stairs with his arms around his head, his eyes empty and his face as pale as marble. Neighbors began to gather outside, talking amongst themselves. Their whispers rose to the night sky, mingling with the flashing lights of police cars. The police began to act quickly. First, they examined the crime scene. At first glance, it looked like an outbreak of spontaneous violence. The signs of a struggle, the chaos in the room, the violent blows that had probably led to Iris's death. But experienced detectives realized that such crimes rarely just happen. Ciara, upon learning of the murder, immediately arrived at the house. She tried to remain calm, but her nervousness was noticeable. At the sight of the police and the crowd gathered around, she looked tense and agitated. Confusion and anxiety shone in her eyes, though outwardly she tried to appear as just a concerned relative. The detectives, who had begun interviewing anyone who might know something, took notice of her. Her behavior seemed odd to them, too emotional for someone who wasn't that close to the victim. She claimed that she was at home that night and didn't hear anything, but when they began to question her further, she strayed from her answers several times. Nevertheless, her testimony was still of little interest to the police. The focus was on Daniel as the closest person to the victim. But Ciara had also been noticed, albeit not immediately. The investigation began to unfold like a detective puzzle, each piece of which had to fall into place. The detectives, examining the bedroom, began to find small but significant details. The signs of a struggle were strong, but it seemed that some items were not randomly placed. For example, the nightlight on the nightstand stood too steady despite the general chaos in the room. This led to the thought that the perpetrator may have been trying to disguise his actions, making it look like a spontaneous attack. The marks on Iris's hands, small cuts and bruises, suggested that she had tried to fight back, but the forces were clearly not equal. Detectives found small pieces of skin in her fingernails, a clear indication that she had managed to scratch her attacker. But there were no signs of struggle on Daniel's body, and his state of shock made it impossible to suspect him at once. Initial interviews with acquaintances and neighbors yielded no significant leads, although everyone unanimously stated that the Phillips family was the perfect couple. No one could imagine that such an atrocity could have occurred in their home. However, as the detectives began to delve deeper into Daniel and Iris's personal life, they discovered that things were far from as smooth as they first appeared. The first hints of something more arose when they began checking Daniel's financial records and phone calls. It was discovered that he had been making numerous calls and appointments in recent months with an unknown number, which they later found out belonged to Ciara. Suspicions began to thicken. They didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but the connection between Daniel and Ciara was beginning to take shape. Sierra claimed she was just a caring relative, but her demeanor, her nervousness, and inconsistent responses made the police wary. Daniel, who was in shock, claimed he knew nothing about what could have led to his wife's death, but his wavering testimony began to cast doubt on him. The police questioned him several times, going back over and over again to details that didn't add up to a coherent picture. There was sincerity in his voice, but the detectives' intuition told them something was wrong. At this point, the detectives began to hypothesize. Who could have had a motive for such a brutal murder? Could it have been a random robber? Or was it a crime of passion? Everything pointed to the fact that the case was not as simple as it seemed in the beginning. Iris had been victimized, but the cause of her death had yet to be fully revealed. The police knew that someone with strong emotions, someone who was close to the victim, was behind it all. Every little detail, whether it was marks on the walls or inconsistencies in statements, indicated that the killer was well acquainted with Iris and may have even lived in the same house with her. The first suspicion fell on Daniel as the closest person to the victim, but his state of shock, the lack of signs of a struggle, and Ciara's nervousness made detectives think of a more complex web of relationships that could have led to the tragedy. The investigation was just beginning. The morning after the murder was bleak and unsettling. The house that had once served as a refuge from the world was now a place of nightmare. Police tape shielded it from nosy neighbors, but neither it nor the police officers who arrived could stem the tide of speculation and rumors. Mapleton was a small town where news traveled at lightning speed, and the murder of Iris Phillips was a topic of discussion on every corner. Detectives Meredith Rain and Dexter Miller, experienced and judicious, knew they were facing a difficult case. At first glance, it looked like a violent outbreak, but with each new piece of evidence, the picture became more and more confusing. Iris was found in her bedroom, shredded and bloody, but the strange details suggested that it wasn't as simple as it first appeared. Meredith, known for her attention to detail, sat at her desk and reviewed the forensic reports. The first analysis showed some strange results. For one thing, the skin under Iris's fingernails was her own. That seemed crazy. How could the victim scratch herself in the midst of such a violent struggle? The medical examiner assumed that Iris was trying to defend herself from the attack, perhaps injuring herself in the process. But self-examination was not the answer here. Second, the blood test showed that half of the fluid at the crime scene wasn't real. It was fake blood, like from theater productions. But why would someone want to splatter fake blood all over the room? Meredith checked the other report, the crime scene survey. The overturned furniture, the signs of a struggle on the walls, the bloody sheets, all made for the illusion of an outburst of rage. But small details like the evenly placed lamp on the nightstand were beginning to make her suspicious. Too elaborate for a random outbreak of violence, she muttered, turning the file folder toward her partner Dexter. It's too clean, Dexter agreed, leaning back in his chair. Maybe this was all a plan and not just plain jealousy? Meredith only nodded. Suddenly they realized that the perpetrator had tried to conjure up an image of unpredictable rage to confuse the investigators, but the details gave away. It had all been carefully planned. Daniel Phillips sat in the interrogation room. His eyes were inflamed from tears and sleepless nights, his hands shaking as he sipped from the cup of cheap coffee he'd been offered. He was a total wreck. The detectives asked him a few questions about where he'd been that night. Daniel didn't shy away from answering, though his words sounded confused and disorganized. He was sitting on the first floor working on his computer, with headphones on, which explained why he hadn't heard anything when the murder was happening. He claimed he didn't hear screams, footsteps, nothing. All of this information seemed logical, but it was where the danger lurked. The evidence was beginning to scatter suspicion in different directions. Are you saying you were sitting with your headphones on and didn't hear your wife being murdered right above you? Meredith asked, not hiding the skepticism in her voice. But there was no sign of forced entry in the house. Someone had to have been in the house. Are you sure you didn't notice anything strange? Daniel shuddered. He kept repeating, I didn't hear anything. I was sitting there with my headphones on. I didn't know. His words sounded plausible, but there was a flaw in it. The detectives were beginning to suspect that everything that had happened might have been planned, including his own excuses. At the same time, Kiara, Iris's cousin, felt a ring of suspicion tightening around her. She tried to hide her nervousness, but the detectives were already beginning to notice her strange behavior. Her statements were often at odds with details that might seem insignificant, but in this context, they took on new meaning. Sierra changed her version of the events of that night several times. At first, she said she was at home and didn't hear what happened until she got the call. But when detectives checked her phone records, they discovered that Sierra had actually called Daniel just minutes before Iris's body was found. That opened up a new lead. The detectives began digging deeper and discovered an even more shocking truth. Sierra and Daniel were having a secret affair. This information immediately made both of them prime suspects. Meredith and Dexter began to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Sierra was Iris's cousin, but their relationship had always been strained. Iris was the family favorite, getting all the attention, while Kiara stayed in the shadows. This created jealousy, which is probably what led to the tragedy. Sierra wanted what she felt was hers, not only Iris's life, but her husband's as well. As the detectives began to look into the jealousy scenario, they couldn't help but wonder, was Daniel an active participant in this plan? His connection to Sierra made him the perfect accomplice, but could he have been reckless enough to kill his own wife? Or was Sierra trying to manipulate him into giving the appearance of his involvement? At the same time, other clues pointed to a more complex motivation. The use of fake blood, the lack of signs of forced entry, the fake struggle marks all suggested that the murder had been carefully planned rather than the result of an impulsive act of violence. The detectives began to suspect that it might have been not only because of passion, but also because of deeper emotions, such as hatred and jealousy. Sierra began to show increasing nervousness. She tried to maintain the appearance of a caring relative, but her inconsistent statements and trembling voice raised suspicions. When she was called back in for questioning, she tried to change her version of events, claiming she knew about Daniel's affair but was trying to stop it. She tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstance, but her behavior told a different story. The detectives continued to build up the pressure. They knew something wasn't adding up. Sierra was clearly hiding something, but there still wasn't enough evidence to press charges. However, every new piece of evidence pointed to her playing a key role in the case. Meredith looked at Dexter as they returned to their office after another interrogation. They had all the clues in their hands, but they needed time to clear things up definitively. In the meantime, Daniel remained in the shadow of suspicion. His state of shock seemed plausible, but many details pointed to his possible involvement. He had been on the first floor at the time of the murder, making him a key witness, but his indifference to what was going on upstairs looked suspicious. Could he really be unaware that his wife had been murdered while in the same house? The detectives began to consider the possibility that Daniel was deliberately ignoring what was going on to cover up his involvement. The detectives began to delve deeper into the Phillips family history. Meredith, known for her ability to notice small details, discovered that Iris and Sierra's story was far more complicated than they had realized. A childhood full of hidden jealousy, resentment, and disappointment opened up new motives for them. Iris had always been the family's favorite, getting the best of everything, and Sierra had been harboring resentment towards her cousin for years. That hatred may have been the catalyst for the tragedy. Sierra wanted not only Daniel, but everything that belonged to Iris. However, the latest find, artificial blood, made investigators wonder about the third person. Someone wanted to create the illusion of a dramatic death, plant false traces, and misdirect the investigation. Several days passed after Iris's murder, and the town of Mapleton was plunged into anxious anticipation. The investigation dragged on, but detectives Meredith Rain and Dexter Miller never stopped their search. They felt the answers were somewhere close at hand, but a key detail that could uncover the truth still eluded them. The house that had once been a cozy haven for Iris and Daniel was now an eerie reminder of tragedy. Everywhere there was a sense of loss and unresolved mystery. More and more the streets led to one figure, Sierra. Her nervous demeanor, inconsistencies in her testimony, and suspicious proximity to Daniel made her the prime suspect. But so far there was no concrete evidence linking her to the murder. Detective Meredith Rain sat at her desk and pondered every step of the case. Something was keeping her on edge. She returned to the crime scene, and began to review the photographs. One detail caught her eye: a blood trail on the floor next to Iris's bed. Meredith zoomed in on the computer screen. It was an odd shoe print, too small for a man, but with a distinctive pattern on the sole that she couldn't recall seeing before. Her experienced eye had noticed something unusual. She remembered the night Ciara had come in for questioning. The woman was wearing an elegant dress and branded shoes with a distinctive pattern on the sole, an expensive shoe that she apparently considered proof of her status. The pattern was too unique to overlook. Meredith instantly put these facts together in her head. The prints at the crime scene and Ciara's shoes matched. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Meredith and Dexter immediately went to Ciara's house. They found her in her living room, nervously leafing through a magazine. Ciara tried to contain her fear, but her hands shook as the detectives approached her. "Miss West," Meredith began, trying to keep a calm tone, "we have a few questions regarding your shoes." Ciara froze in place, not understanding where the detective was going with this. Her eyes darted from one detective to the next, until she noticed the box Meredith was holding. It contained her shoes. "We found shoe prints at the crime scene," Meredith continued, "and they match the sole pattern of these shoes." Ciara tried to object, but her voice betrayed her. Her face began to turn white, and her breathing became more frequent and heavier. "You were at Iris's house that night," Meredith stated confidently, "and your footprints tell us more than you realize." Ciara was brought in for questioning. She could no longer hold herself together. Panic had taken over her mind. She realized that everything was falling apart, but even in that moment she tried to deny the obvious. Her version of events quickly fell apart. Step by step, the detectives rebuilt the picture of that night. Ciara broke into Iris's house in the afternoon. She knew Daniel would be at work, and Iris would be at her regular meeting with her friends. Ciara hid in the closet outside the bedroom, lurking and waiting for the right moment. All the while, her mind was spinning with thoughts of how she would finally get rid of her cousin and take her place next to Daniel. She waited for Iris to come home and be alone. At night, when Iris fell asleep, Ciara came out of hiding. She had been preparing for this moment for a long time. She'd brought with her fake blood and made a mess of the murder scene to create the illusion of a savage attack, right down to the scattered belongings and overturned furniture. Everything was carefully thought out. The fake blood was to enhance the dramatic effect, so that Iris would be remembered not just as a woman who had died at the hands of a killer, but as the victim of a brutal, brutal crime. But most importantly, Ciara planned to make sure no one suspected her. She planned to make it look like a random murder in a fit of rage. When her crime was complete, Ciara left the house. She did it discreetly while Daniel was downstairs. He locked the door before going to bed, unaware that the killer had already left the house. Ciara figured her plan was perfect, but one small print she hadn't noticed ruined her entire plan. The imprint of the sole of her shoes in the fake blood was the key that opened the detective's door to a clue. Meredith and Dexter pieced together every piece of evidence, every fact, step by step. Ciara couldn't handle the pressure. She broke down in the interrogation as she was pinned against the wall with irrefutable evidence. Her attempts to deny everything looked pathetic. Eventually, she confessed. Envy, hidden for years, turned into a poison that corroded her mind. Ciara could never accept that Iris was the family favorite. Her successes, her marriage to Daniel, her life of happiness and acceptance all poisoned Ciara's existence. She wanted to take her place. The affair with Daniel was just a way to achieve her goal, but when it became clear that Daniel wasn't going to leave Iris, Ciara realized that the only way out was to get her cousin out of the way. The bloody spectacle she put on was not just a way to kill Iris, but a last-ditch attempt to humiliate her even in death. Ciara wanted everyone to remember Iris not as a happy woman, but as a victim of brutal violence. In the final scenes, Daniel sat alone in his house. His life had been shattered. He had lost both women who were important to him, Iris, his wife, and Ciara, the woman with whom he had entered into a confusing and destructive relationship. Now he was left alone, racked with guilt and regret. The house, once full of light and warmth, had become empty and cold. All that remains of his perfect life are shards of memories and the pain of loss. Meredith and Dexter returned to the station. Pondering the nature of human envy and the darkness it can breed, Ciara had been convicted, but their work had not brought them satisfaction. The case reminded them of how dangerous hidden emotions can be, and how deeply hatred and envy can lurk in people. Ciara was arrested and charged with murder. Her dreams shattered, as well as the lives of those around her. The final act of her envy and hatred led to a tragedy that destroyed everything in its path.